I'm standing on Government Street at its intersection with George Street. Behind me at number 1060 has stood a house since at least the 1870s when a cotton merchant named Levi Lawler had a very nice wooden two-story home here. At the turn of the 20th century, the house was sold to Richard Clark. Richard Clark was a local attorney who also served very well as our congressman from this district. And it was Clark who had an unknown architect design a very elegant home in a French style that stood here. It was Mr. Clark who put through the legislation to establish Alabama's Department of Archives and History in Montgomery, one of the first in the United States to be established. It was also in 1902 that Mr. Clark cut the ribbon for the new Athelstan Club down on Beundel Square. And in his speech, which the newspaper termed as quite witty, he said the importance of a men's club like the Athelstan was that it provided a hearthstone for the bachelor and refuge for the married man. That article was in the next morning's paper. When he came down to the breakfast table, Mrs. Clark had just finished reading the paper. She slammed down the newspaper when he asked about his breakfast and said, "You can go to your damn refuge for your breakfast," and walked out of the room. After Mr. Clark's death in 1906, which occurred while he was on a trip to Colorado, a hurricane struck Mobile, and when the body finally made it back to Mobile, Christ Church, where the funeral was to take place, was destroyed. So the funeral had to be postponed and actually took place out of his home here on Government Street. The next owner had a very colorful history. His name was Lawler-Hubbard. He and his wife Emma moved in here after Mr. Clark's death and lived here until 1919 when Mrs. Hubbard and her husband divorced. She moved out and a young woman named Dee moved in, and they were married. The house was remodeled in 1926 with plans by George B. Rogers. The cost was an estimated $60,000 in 1926, and it brought it to its present appearance. Mr. Hubbard only lived until 1929. He was a principal with United Fruit Company. Now, United Fruit Company had a pretty bad reputation in Central America. In fact, his reputation was so badly that a playwright named Lillian Hillman wove the name Hubbard into her play The Little Foxes to describe a notoriously greedy family in southern Alabama at the turn of the 20th century. Lawler-Hubbard died in 1929 at the age of 60. His 32-year-old widow remained in the house. 3 years later, at the age of 35, she married a 20-year-old dropout from Annapolis. That marriage didn't last, and there was at least one more until her death in 1947, when she died as Mrs. Lawler-Hubbard and was buried at Magnolia Cemetery. After that, the house was converted by the YWCA for their purposes, and then they added a Western motel-like wing for residents. When the YWCA abandoned the site, it sat vacant and abandoned for quite a few years until a local church purchased it. They've restored the home beautifully and have used the former dormitory space for a daycare center.